And good morning, everybody. My name is Nicholas Whitaker. I'm the Media Outreach Manager at the News Lab at Google. Today, we're again joined by some experts on AMP to talk about AMP and specifically analytics. This is the fourth in a series of 7 office hours that we're going to be doing. You can find out more information about the News Lab at g.co/newslab. And on that channel, on that website, you'll also find links to all of our social media accounts, including our Twitter page and our Google Plus page. If you're watching this Hangout right now, you've probably already found either our YouTube page or our Hangout or our Google Plus page. And on both of those channels, you'll find all of the previous events that we've had talking about AMP specifically, and a lineup for all the future events coming up. So we'll have 4 more events coming up each Friday at 9 a.m. Pacific time. We definitely want your feedback and want your input, so if you have questions or comments, send those to us ahead of time. Check out our Google Plus and our YouTube page for more information on that. But we have a lot to go over today, so I don't want to take up too much time. I would like to introduce my colleague Stacy Chan, who will be introducing the rest of our guests today.
Thanks, Nick. Again, my name is Stacy Chan. I'm on the news and search team over here at Google, and really excited to continue hosting these series of Hangouts because we really get a chance to deep dive into specific components of AMP that all of you have been asking about. Today, we have our product manager, Rudy Galfi, who's going to go over analytics. He's the expert on all things analytics, so send any questions you have to him through our comment section on the G Plus page. And we also have some esteemed guests who are also experts on analytics in their own right. We've got Josh Schwartz and Chris Bro from Chartbeat. Hey, guys. And we've also got Dan Carey and Avi Mehta from Google Analytics. And so they're going to talk a little bit about how their respective products are fitting into the overall AMP initiative. All right. And I think we have some folks joining from different news publications. They're probably going to be hopping on the call later. So that's who you're going to see popping up. But for now, Rudy, do you want to go ahead and get started on your wonderful presentation you have for us?
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks for having me. Okay, so I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. All right. So yeah, I'm Rudy Galfi. I'm a product manager working on the AMP project, or Accelerated Mobile Pages. And here today I want to talk to you about what we're doing with analytics in the format. So this is the first of a series of Hangouts we're going to have covering a few critical areas of AMP. We actually, when we went out with the preview back in October, we took a step back and we said, like, these are the 4 critical areas that we really want to dive deep on and figure out how to move forward. So we have analytics, and then those other areas are paywalls, ads, and format, and I believe we have more in the series over the coming weeks to talk through those. So when it comes to analytics, let's take a look at it from a high level. So why do publishers or anybody who's building an AMP want to have analytics? Well, of course, you want to be able to manage your business, get the insights you need. You want to be able to produce better and more relevant content for your users. And finally, you can also have analytics set up so that you will get the data and signal you need to improve the user experience. And at kind of a more specific level, you can look at any page you might visit on the web, and you can see what sorts of stuff is going on that page in terms of different libraries that are installed. And it comes across that it's clearly important to have analytics integration. Here's an example where, for example, you see 6 different analytics services provided, and this is not too uncommon a state. So clearly, this is a very important area, and we actually thought with AMP that we could, take this and do something interesting with it. We think the state we've reached is a little bit broken in that you'll have these 6 different services running, but in a lot of cases, they might want to be doing the same things behaviorally on the page in terms of instrumentation. And so we thought about how could AMP actually act to provide some unique value here in this ecosystem. And so our philosophy comes down to this. We want to measure once and report to many. So basically what this means is when somebody instruments their page and says, I want to be able to collect analytics and get that and collect that data and get it back to analyze it, we think that if there's a specific thing that you want to measure, but that multiple providers might want to measure it, then we should just measure that thing once and then use that same value and report it out to many people. So you don't have, say, multiple services trying to collect the scroll point on the page and then be able to transmit that back. So that's kind of the philosophy we used in building out analytics in AMP. And within AMP, we have two solutions. So one is called AMP Pixel, and the other one is called AMP Analytics. And these both have various trade-offs. In fact, one is much simpler and lightweight than the other one. And so what I want to do now is step through what these two solutions offer and give you some insight as to which one you should choose, and also explain how you would use them. So starting off with AMP Pixel. So AMP Pixel works quite a bit like a tracking pixel. So if you're familiar with that concept on the web, where you'll use an image tag and request an image resource, it's usually transparent, so the user wouldn't see it. This is meant to behave in a similar way. So syntactically, you'll add this element to your markup called AMP Pixel. You'll specify a source, and that source will indicate a URL, and you'll do a GET request. And basically, by doing that GET request, some server will receive that request, and this URL could contain data that you want to pass to that server. So in this example, I'm actually just passing it a random value, and I'm doing that by using the random string that you can see there toward the end of the URL. So this is what we call a substitution, and there's a bunch of data that you could encode in this way. And so actually I want to talk through in a little more detail like what the different options that AMP offers here, because there are quite a few. So when it comes to substitutions, there are 4 categories. So looking at the first page here, we have a bunch of substitutions that handle details relating to the page and its content. So you can get stuff relating to the URL, or things relating to some like markup in the page, like the link relationship tags, which specify the canonical URL and things like that. You can also get things like the documents referrer. And so obviously publishers want to be able to use things like that to figure out how traffic is coming to their site. We also have a bunch of substitutions available related to performance. So you can, basically we use, what AMP will do is AMP runs the code required to instrument, and it will, execute the JavaScript necessary to look up various times related to performance. And so you can use these substitutions to grab those values that AMP knows about, and you could pass those along in any requests that you want to make. And then looking here at the next page, there's a few more buckets. So the third bucket relates to device and browser information. So you can get information relating to the screen size, the browser's language setting, and document character set and things like that. And then the fourth bucket is kind of just more miscellaneous, and there's actually a few interesting things in here. So there's a client identifier. So what this has to do with is if you want to do some tracking of users uniquely, you can use the client identifier substitution. And basically the way this works is when AMP pages are just served on the publisher's origin, then this scope ID, which is a parameter that you pass into this, can basically read the cookie value corresponding to the scope ID. And then the other thing you can do with the client ID is you can gate the issuance of the client ID on the acceptance of some sort of visible user notification prompt. And so if you think about like policy or regulation where you may not be able to set cookies until the user is consented, this allows you to achieve scenarios like that. The other case with the client ID, of course, is that AMP supports and works in a caching environment. And so in this context, this client ID could be set, and it would be set in the cache's context. So we designed this to work both in the case where AMPs are hosted on the publisher origin, as well as cases where they're hosted on a cache. And then we have a few other variables in here related to page view ID, so that you can sort of uniquely identify that this page view that happened, and when you see multiple requests, you can correlate them. Random I mentioned earlier, and timestamp, of course, so you can track timing-related information. So with that view on AMP Pixel, it's a really straightforward, pretty simple tag. It basically only fires when it gets visible on the screen somehow, and it just will send that one request essentially when it gets rendered. AMP Analytics is a much more comprehensive and configurable analytics framework, and so now I want to walk through a bit how that works. So this is some pretty stripped down code that shows how you would integrate AMP analytics into your page. It's really as simple as some markup that you'll put in the head section and then some additional markup in the body section corresponding to the AMP analytics tag itself. And you can have one or more of these. So let's dive into the details here. So the first thing to call out here is the stuff that will go into the head section. And this is basically an include statement. So AMP analytics was built in AMP as an extended component. And what that means is there's several pieces of functionality that don't work by default when you include the regular AMP library. And so if you want to get access to additional features like AMP analytics, or some of the other features we provide like video player embeds like AMP YouTube, then you have to actually declare that you want to use those extended features. And so to do that, you'll specify that with an include statement that will appear in the head here. And basically, you'll just say that I want to use AMP analytics, and then you can see here that this is pointing to an AMP analytics .js file. And so this has all of the logic relating to how the AMP analytics framework will run on the page. So then moving beyond that, we can look into the kind of code that you would put into the body section. So here's an example, again, pretty stripped down example of what some AMP analytics tag markup may look like. And so this will also be a good way for me to explain a little bit, how analytics in general works when it's, on these pages in terms of what the publisher declares, and you can see how this kind of breaks down into different features. So what you'll do first, sorry, I'll step back. So you'll have some configuration, basically. This whole block is basically a JSON configuration. And there's a lot of different parameters and values you can set here. But when it comes to the configuration holistically, there's a few different options that are actually offered by the framework. So the first thing you can do is you can have what we call a remote configuration. So you can actually take all that JSON and you can actually have it be living in its own standalone file, and then you can just reference the configuration file, and basically AMP will go fetch that, and then it'll bring the configuration in. And so this can be useful because what publishers can do is they could, for example, host this configuration on their publisher origin, and it will give access to them give them access to things like cookies, for example, on that request. So this can be used to get the context that the origin has and pass along any additional data that might be helpful as part of the analytics configuration, because ultimately you might want to pass those values and variables on to the collection endpoints you're using with AMP analytics. So there's the remote configuration. And this actually has what we call the highest precedence. Next down in precedence would be what we call an inline configuration. And that's a lot like what I was just showing you, where you have the AMP analytics tag on the page itself, and you will just declare how that thing should behave right there inline. And then the lowest level of precedence would be a vendor configuration. So the way this works is we actually have a method by which vendors like Google Analytics or Chartbeat can specify the way that their configuration should look across all customers and to across all different scenarios as customers might be interested in. And then this would get layered on top of any additional configuration the customer may provide. For example, the customer would uniquely have their own account ID and things like that. And that's actually why the vendor configuration is the lowest precedence. It's so that you can layer on top additional information that may be more specific to the publisher. So those are the different configuration options that you can use with AMP. And again, they have varying levels of precedence so that they can get layered on top of each other to produce an overall configuration. So going back to the code, let's start stepping through some of the components of the configuration. So the first thing is you will define a series of one or more requests. So these requests are named. So in this case, we have a named request called page view. And then you can see here, this is just a URL. And you'll notice something about this URL. It has a bunch of kind of braces and dollar signs, which are where substitutions can happen. And remember, when we were talking about AMP Pixel, we covered substitutions before. So basically what this request is, it's the hit request that you want to send. And this is how you'll pass data. So if you're interested in collecting the account ID because you need to uniquely identify an account, then you can do that. And if you want to pass the URL because you have a bunch of events associated with your hit request and you want to know what page those are happening on, you'll need to pass the URL. And so you'll associate one named trigger, one named request that will be fired on a trigger, which is a concept I'll cover shortly. And as I said, there's going to be key value pairs that you can have in here that are, and what these will do is these will act as a way to sort of compose requests. So let me turn to this example that I have here. So here you can imagine I have two requests. I have one that I've called host, and then I have one that I've called page view. And I can actually use the string defined for host, and then I can put that into the definition for page view. And so in this way, you can compose together different requests. You can define things that will be consistent across all of your requests and just declare those once, and then you can have additional named requests that would be used in different scenarios. Okay, so moving on. You can also define variables that will be relevant to this specific AMP analytics tag. So these would, I mentioned an example before, like things like an account name or account value. So this is really simple. It's just a name value association. And as you saw before with substitutions, these work very similarly. So if you look at the example here, before you would have $ braces with account, and then after what'll happen is based on the configuration where you set account as ABC123, that'll be what's actually put into that request, so that when it gets fired off, you'll get that value at your server. And actually what's really cool here is that some of these variables start defined because they correspond to some of those substitutions that AMP knows about. So AMP has already actually populated the namespace with some of the values for things it knows about. So if you use $random, then that'll function like the random substitution where it'll just randomly generate a number. Or if you use $screen width, then you'll be basically using the screen width substitution. So this will tell AMP, like, hey, go look up the screen width and then put that value in here so that it can be transmitted. Okay, so let's move on to triggers now. So you remember I said that you'll be declaring these requests, and then the eventual idea is that you're going to be firing these requests on a trigger. So a trigger is a named event. So here the example would be track page view that will cause a request to fire. And there's a couple additional values that need to get set here. So there's one value called on, and so this can be something like visible or click, or we've actually just added a couple more, things called scroll and timer. And so you can have these event types, and they'll fire based on different scenarios and conditions. So visible will fire when the page becomes visible for the first time. So this is very analogous to the AMP pixel. It's a little different because AMP pixel actually works by itself becoming visible, whereas in AMP analytics, the visible trigger, it actually talks to the runtime, and the runtime has an awareness of when it actually has first rendered the page, essentially, and that's when this will fire. So this is basically guaranteed to always fire on a page load, as long as the page does in fact load. And then we have additional event types like click, which will fire on a click, and then this can be further customized using a selector key value pair where you can talk in terms of CSS selectors to specify which elements in the page you actually want to track with the click. And then there's another event type called timer, which will fire on a specific interval. So it'll fire once, and then say 15 seconds later it'll fire again, and then 15 seconds after that it'll fire again. And then there's also a timer spec associated with this where you can control that interval, and you can also define a maximum so that you're not, if the page has just been sitting there for a really long time, you don't keep issuing those requests. A couple more kind of nice things here to know about. So there's a transport configuration. So this offers various ways to try to send the data. There are various protocols you could use. There's a precedence associated with this. So beacon has the highest precedence down to image. And by default, AMP defines all of these transport options to be true. And it will try to use the highest precedence method that's enabled and allowed by the browser. And so it'll just keep falling through until it finds a way that it will work. So in some cases, you may not be able to support one of these methods. And so you may just set a couple of the values to false and then leave one of them true. And so you can see that happening in this example where I've set image to true. And so in that case, the image transport protocol would be used. And then, of course, if that's not available for whatever reason, then it would fail, and actually the hit would not be sent. So you can specifically customize how the request should get sent in this way. So I want to come back to a point that I made a little bit earlier, but is really worth repeating. So, with AMP Analytics, you see that the publisher basically determines where the requests go. They define the requests themselves. They add the AMP Analytics tag directly to their page, possibly with the assistance of a vendor who's going to also provide markup. And so this means that you can send data to your own servers and to a vendor, or you could always just send it to yourself, even twice, or you could send all the data to vendors and not collect any of it yourself. And you can go super crazy, and you can have like many of these configurations where you're sending it to yourself in different contexts to multiple vendors. But I want to come back to the earlier point philosophically with AMP, which is that even if you're doing this where you're sending lots of data all over the place, at the end of the day, if the same data point needs to be measured and then it will be handed off to one or more parties, we'll just try to make a measurement once for that, and then all the parties who need to see that information will go ahead and see it. So I mentioned vendor configuration, so let's talk a little bit more about that. So vendor configuration is a way for to reference a common configuration that will integrate with a vendor. So the way this works is this configuration lives in the AMP open source code. Specifically, there's a file called vendors.js. And what's nice about this is it's one place that you can change as a vendor to update all your clients. So this actually is another differentiation point with AMP Pixel. With AMP Pixel, all of the implementation is happening inline. But as you can see with AMP Analytics, you can have implementation that's actually controlled via a separate file configuration, or you could actually have configuration that's controlled in this vendor specification. And so if a vendor wanted to change the way that they're going to collect the data with the different hit requests and variable definitions and things like that, they can actually come into the AMP open source code and just make that change directly, and then all of the publishers who are using that vendor will just automatically get that update. So let's see a little bit how this looks like in action. So I'm actually using a real example here. This is an integration from ComScore that they've introduced. They actually offer both a Pixel and an AMP Analytics implementation. So with ComScore, this is what their vendor configuration looks like, and you can see that pretty clearly here. It's named ComScore, and then it has all of that sort of JSON expressed configuration that I talked about before. And so you can see a lot of things going on here. They have some variable definitions. They have the request defined. And so they have host, which gets layered on top of base, which gets layered as a page view request, which is the one which is actually assigned to a trigger. And there's a trigger on page view, right? And they only use the image transport protocol here. So with this vendor's configuration, what you can do on your page is it's as simple as just saying you want to use AMP Analytics, and then you use the type attribute for AMP Analytics to say ComScore. And furthermore, as I said, you can do inline configuration. So you actually need to do this if you wanted to integrate. It's likely your ComScore ID is not the one that they've put there by default. So say your ID was something like 7 nines, then you would go ahead and put those in as your C2 value. And then the way this actually works on your page is it's like you had your AMP Analytics tag defined, and then that variable that you specified on top is actually the one that gets put in. And then all the rest of the behavior that ComScore defined in their vendor configuration would carry through here. And so then you can see in that page view request, one of the parameters that's going to get passed through there is C2, which you, as the publisher, are directly defining, as well as a bunch of different substitutions, relating to things like the document refer or the URL. So hopefully that's a really helpful overview on where we're at with AMP Analytics. There's much more to come. So as vendor, you should definitely come talk to us on GitHub to add your configuration so that it can be used by all of your customers, and that it provides kind of that nice update story. But for everyone, come on into the project and tell us about your needs. As I said, we've just been building this since we've launched the developer preview in October. I think we've come a really long way, and we're really interested in supporting as many different analytics capabilities as we can. And we're really excited to do so using that sort of philosophy that I talked about earlier. So there you see the link to GitHub. And yeah, come please tell us about different requirements you have and different things you need from the framework, and let's go ahead and build something. So with that, I'm going to wrap up, and thank you, and look forward to hearing questions now.
Thanks, Rudy. That was great. So we have a whole lot of questions that are coming in via the chat window here, which we'll get to in a little bit. But I wanted to take advantage of all of these fantastic guests that we have in Hangout right now. So amongst those of us that are in the office hour, who has some questions for Rudy?
Or maybe I'll pose a question to the guests, since I know Rudy mentioned a lot about vendor configurations. We've got two great vendors here. So how about Josh and Chris, do you want to briefly talk about how Chartbeat plans to configure your guys' code for AMP?
Yeah, definitely. We, I believe, late yesterday got our vendor configuration merged into the master branch. So it's now up and available. Super exciting. So that means that somebody can apply our vendor configuration to AMP pages going forward. The good thing that we're excited about in how everything ended out is we're able to record all the data that we record through a normal Chartbeat implementation on a page. So things that people might be used to seeing in Chartbeat, like how far down the page a person scrolled, or how wide the browser is, or what device somebody's on, or anything like that, we're still able to gather. And with the timer element, we're able to measure concurrence just like we normally do, and so on. So the kind of synopsis of that is it's a pretty easy implementation, as I think you just went through, and the numbers that a person should expect to be able to see are pretty much the same as what they see with any other sort of normal HTML page.
That's great, because it sounds like you can measure things far more than just clicks, which is actually what a lot of the folks watching are asking about. So I think that's really, really helpful.
And we have one question actually from Christian Oliveira. He was just asking, quite frankly, is Chartbeat integration ready now, or when will that be ready?
Yeah, so the Chartbeat integration is out there in the wild. It's something that we're working with initial partners as they're coming on and making sure that everything is 100% up. So Christian or anyone else who's listening who's interested should get in touch with us. They can email support@Chartbeat, and we can sort of start to walk people through. There's a queue that we're working through for getting people up to speed, but we're definitely starting to work through it.
Yeah, part of that question I think also touches on AMP's release process, and I'm not sure where we're at with the release, but as Josh was saying, it made it to head yesterday, and so that'll be rolled out as part of the next release.
And we'll have more information as far as like rollouts and availability and all of that in future Hangouts as well. So stay tuned with all of that information.
And another thing to point out is we are still working on it. As we said before, feel free to ask questions, create issues, or send out pull requests on the repository. That helps a lot. We are still building some parts of it. And if you chime in, you'll be able to get features. And
great. So Avi, do you want to jump in, or Dan, do you want to jump in on the status of how Google Analytics is going to be measuring clicks or other KPIs in a post-AMP world?
I can take that. So AMP Analytics for us is built on top of our measurement protocol. So if you used that in the past, it should be very familiar. So GA hits, GA events, GA's ad integrations, our remarketing, our demographic features. Those are going to keep working with AMP. So you can do those simple implementations that kind of Rudy showed a preview of earlier. We have stuff in our dev guides as well as in our help center that links to it. Shows you how to set everything up, has code samples. So in 4 lines, you can get most of the features that you're already using today. With a few more lines, you can get pretty much everything. So it's very nice.
yeah, and I would just like to add a little bit. Like AMP is very flexible in that way. You can do a lot more things. If like there's a basic simple configuration that you use for GA, for Chartbeat, or for any other vendor out there. But if you want to do more, it's very easy to do that. You can just host your own configuration. You can provide whatever values you want to provide to the page, and then basically the analytics will work exactly the way you want it to.
Yeah, and I wanted to come back to an earlier point too, which Avi made, which is this is still a work in progress. I think we've really come a long way, but still a work in progress, and we're really excited about the things we've landed really recently. In fact, we've had click click tracking and the page view tracking for a while, but scroll was just added recently, and huge thanks to Avi and his team for building that feature. Also helpful input from the community on how it should function, and then also the timer landed recently as well, and so Chartbeat actually helped with building that. So thanks to Chris and Josh and the team for landing that. We're really excited to have that functionality.
All right, let's take a couple questions from the Q&A here. We have a couple kind of general questions and a few very specific questions. Mr. Webmaster asks, he says, can you explain the process for vendor configuration?
Yeah, so I'll try to take that. So hopefully the things I walked through in the slides were helpful. What I would say to layer on top of that is if you are a vendor, basically the process is that there's a vendors.js file in AMP under the AMP Analytics component directory. You can take a look at that. There's already, I think, at least 3 different vendor examples that you can look at, and you can see kind of how that configuration works. And then using the kind of description I went through before, or reading through the documentation we provide, you can kind of understand how that layering happens so that you can figure out like what is the right code to put in the vendor configuration, and then what is the code you expect your customers to implement so that you can build that into documentation that you would provide to them. So I think from the vendor side, that's kind of how things look. And if you are interested in going that path, for example, you're supporting an analytics service, then you can file an intent to implement on GitHub and say, I would like to add this. And then you can just kind of post a spec there for how you expect things to work, like what your vendor configuration would look like, how you would expect your end users to use it, and then we can work through the code review process to get that added. So that's from the vendor side. If you are a customer wanting to use a vendor integration, I think there's, if you're willing to dive into the code, I think you can definitely lean on the documentation and the code in the repository to be able to get moving with integrating there. But I also think the vendors are doing a really nice job of making documentation available so that you'll be able to get that integration up and running, as soon as it's ready. And as Josh was saying, like, things are landing day by day, and so there might be a little lag, but in terms of when the documentation is available, but the code's all there, so you can definitely get started, pretty soon.
Great. Another question. Since AMP pages may or may not link to other AMP pages, is there a best practice on how to get consistent funnel or user referral metrics with AMP?
So, I guess so. We offer the document refer, substitution. So if you want to get referrals using that, that should work regardless of whether it's the person's coming from an AMP page to an AMP page or vice versa. So you can definitely lean on tools like that. I don't know if the other GA or Chartbeat have more around how you're expecting the referral use cases to work within your products and could shed some light.
Yeah, so I think if you think about how data will be displayed in a Chartbeat dashboard, of course, a person coming from, let's say, Google search into an AMP page, we expect the referral to look just as it would for anything else. So you'll be able to see how many people are coming from Google, how many people are coming from Pinterest and landing on AMP pages. From AMP pages to AMP pages, the one thing to note, and the Google folks may have some insight into this as well, that because AMP URLs are different than regular URLs, the referrer that you'll see will be different than a person coming from a non-AMP page to the same page, but the referral will be there. So you'll be able to see how much traffic's being driven from AMP page to AMP page, but it'll be on a different URL than just say seeing, okay, there was traffic from this Chartbeat.com page to this other Chartbeat.com page.
Right.
Yeah. In addition to that, so there are 2 things here. The initial referral that comes from google.com to the AMP page, and then from AMP page to other AMP pages. So the line can be maintained right now, so you will know exactly where the user is coming from, what the referrer was. But we are also adding another feature called the viewer. So that will basically tell you that on any given AMP page, what was the original source of the traffic. So let's say you are down the chain, you've clicked on a couple of AMP pages and you've reached a particular AMP page. If you're still in the same viewer, we will be able to tell you that, okay, originally the user was on google.com, and that's where they came from.
Yeah. Yeah, and huge shout out to the publisher community that we're working with, because they were actually, you know, we'd been considering this feature, but they had also just kind of pinged us recently about it, and so you know, once we heard about it, like, yes, absolutely, we want to build that, and so we filed an issue, and so we're tracking building that. Which
I think is a really good advertisement for, please send in your questions and comments and ideas so that as we're building this out, we can add those features that are needed. We got another question from Hannah, and then a related question, another one from Christian. Are AMP cookies third-party, and will every page look like a new user for sites that don't support third-party cookies? And then the related question, how are you planning to solve the duplication of unique visitors AMP might cause? Duplication, at least if it's finally integrated in lots of apps like Twitter and LinkedIn. If I open a link in a site in each of those apps, would that be like more users, or how does that actually work?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, so AMP is designed to work in a number of different viewing contexts. So we were just talking about the viewer, and of course, cacheability is integral to how AMP works. So AMPs can show without being served off of a cache. The framework is designed to work that way, but the files still need to, you know, be able to be cached if platforms choose that as their delivery mechanism. So when it comes to the discussion of cookies, a lot of these details depend on the exact viewing context, and we've tried to account for the different contexts and how we've built the framework. In some situations, you do run up against you know, browser policies regarding cookies. You know, in some cases, AMP is actually in a third-party context for the cookies, so it can be challenging to set those. We've tried to introduce features like the remote configuration, which will actually let you get some visibility into first-party cookies on, say, the origin site if the AMP is not on the origin site. And so using that, you can actually pass the data relevant to that first-party, you know, to the origin context through, and then you can basically, if you're interested in it, you could, you know, consider strategies for doing some ID merging. So hopefully that's helpful in kind of giving an overview on how it works. There's a lot of detail here, but the fundamentals to understand are, yes, you can have, you know, specifically the unique user identification will rely on that client ID substitution. In some cases, that will actually just end up being the first-party cookie that you specify if you are in a first-party context. If you're not in a first-party context, then there's other affordances for that, but the ID would be different. And in that case, situation, we've introduced capabilities where you can look to doing some sort of join if that's what you're interested in doing. I should also note that, you know, when we talk about these things, you can often have different, you know, platform contexts, and so, you know, often what we see in different platform contexts is that the page will actually be loaded in a web view where there actually is no cookie jar existing already, and so you actually start with a default case where you do see these users as independent, and so what we try to do in AMP is, you know, considering that's the way that we expect the framework to be designed, we try to introduce some mitigation so that you can get visibility into those distinct users when they are kind of showing up in these two different platform situations, and tie them back together if that's what you're interested in doing.
That's great, and most of this information, this is going to be available in the FAQ section of the site, as well as documentation later on. Are these the types of questions that would be fielded in that?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely we want to capture all of the functional characteristics and document those. Some of this gets to like very specific like business logic on how you want to treat things, and so in those cases, like you know, I would encourage just kind of reviewing the documentation, reviewing the strategy with your technical teams to figure out like what is the right way to assemble the tools that are being provided to get the outcomes that you want.
That's great. Nicholas Flood asks, he says, why does Google suggest that we use a new property for AMP pages? Why not just set up a filter in the main profile so you can have an overview of total traffic?
I'll take that one. We just suggested a separate property for some of the identity issues that Rudy mentioned. Filters are another way that you could approach it. Just for most people, setting up a separate property is a bit easier in the short term. And that way you also have more flexibility to test around. Like Avi was mentioning, AMP Analytics for GA is hugely flexible. You can do tons of different things. And we don't want people to be worried about taking risks with, you know, polluting their past data and use that for an excuse not to explore all the capabilities that they have with this.
Great. Here's maybe
to add to that.
All right, go ahead.
the behavior of users is going to be slightly different on AMP versus not on AMP. Like Google makes the pages super fast, so the pages are going to load very quickly, as opposed to normal pages which are super slow, which can be super slow. Also, people can navigate from one page to the other. They can come back to the original article. And that's going to result in a lot of different user behavior. If you add it to the same property, it can get confusing very quickly. It's not impossible to do it, but it will get confusing. So we basically made the recommendation based on what we think makes most sense.
So really, it's an issue of keeping a separation between your older data and like the new data when you implement AMP, and really just kind of keeping things very clean so you can see a cross comparison between the two.
It's one way of viewing it is old data versus new data. It's closer to saying they're different types of data almost.
Mm-hmm.
They're just very different user contexts in some instances, so it's easier to split them up. To compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges.
Great. Another quick question from Jesse Garner. He says, are there any clear SEO advantages for supporting AMP? Which is, I think, actually kind of a related question. I would actually venture a comment on this, that it's actually more about user experience and about functionality than per se like SEO advantage. But I'd be interested to hear what you guys might have to say around that.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely when we talk about AMP, the whole notion is, and Malta, I think, did a really fantastic job of explaining this in his session, I guess it was just last week. With AMP, what we see is that you can get a very, well-tuned, optimized site, but that's not the pattern we see amongst many people. And so what AMP does is it basically raises the baseline so that it's not hard to build a site that's going to be very performant and be a good experience for users. And that's, I think, the main reason to buy into AMP is that you want to be able to provide your users with that kind of consistent level of good experience.
That's great. So we have another one. This is a more technical question. Another one from Hussein Moshanali. Hussein, thanks for again joining us. He was with us a few Hangouts ago, asking some really good questions. So it's good to see you again. He says, my AMP pages are valid with the validator built in Chrome, and the structured data testing tool doesn't show any errors with the microdata, but still the AMP report in Search Console shows tons of errors, and none of my pages are indexed at this time. Where would we direct him for information on how to kind of triage some of that?
So you said that Search Console was reporting errors or was not reporting errors?
Yeah, let me back that one up. So let's see. He says they are valid with the validator built in Chrome, and the structured data testing tool doesn't show any errors with the microdata, but still the AMP report in Search Console shows tons of errors, and none of my pages are being indexed at this time.
Okay, so yeah, I think with that one, so when it comes to a Google search integration, there are two key things to be aware of. So one is that if you're writing an AMP, you need to be assured that your AMP files are in valid AMPs. So it sounds like you're doing the right thing there in terms of, you're developing the pages, you're using the hash development equals 1 tool to go into the console and be able to see any sort of validation errors. And if that's all clean, then that validator is giving a pass result. The other thing with Google Search integration is that you have to have the structured data markup be correct according to the rich snippets guidelines that are posted. So it sounds like you're using the structured data testing tool, and if you're confirming that that looks all good, then that should be the path there. When it comes to the Search Console, if you are still seeing errors there, there could be a couple of reasons. One could be that the Search Console has not quite caught up to the latest validation that AMP requires. So I don't know what the nature of the errors you're seeing is. If it's structured data, I guess that's a little possible, although I think that'd be a little less likely because that's all like Google related. Like Search Console is Google provided and structured data is Google specified. So I'd expect those to be a little bit more in sync. But if you're getting validation errors due to in Search Console but not on AMP, it could just be that there's some lag there, and that the thing you're doing would be valid shortly because the Search Console validator still needs to catch up. So one thing I'd encourage is look closely at the kinds of errors that you're getting in Search Console, and maybe take a look at the AMP spec to see if there were any changes recently in that area. And if you do see that, then that could really strongly indicate that, that we just need to catch up on the validation logic between the two places. If not, then unfortunately, like I would need to know more specifics about the kind of errors you're seeing to be able to diagnose what would be going on.
Great, thanks, Rudy. Christian has another question. He says, are we getting something like the queries section from Search Console where we can get numbers of impressions or clicks or positions, etc., for AMP carousel or any other places where AMP articles appear in Google search?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, so this is talking about in Search Console, there's basically some analytics that you can get from that point of view that Google provides. So my understanding is that that those sections will, they exist for regular web pages, and that they will be built for AMP, to support AMP pages as well. I'm not sure if as Google, the spec has been finalized in terms of what kind of data and insights you would get there, but I would expect at least some parity with the kind of results that you can get off of normal web pages at the very least.
That's great. And we got another one that might be a follow-up. Justin Style asks, he says, how are search results in Search Console impacted by AMP, and how are AMP position related to current position data?
Sorry, can you run the first part of that past me again?
Yeah, how are search results in Search Console impacted by AMP?
Okay. So the thing about that question that confused me is saying search results in Search Console. Let me see if I can try to take it. If the question is more around how search itself is impacted by AMP, if people are familiar with the demo that we released back in October at g.co/amp demo, you can see the kinds of experiences that Google is anticipating to build around AMP. And so you can also see there, some of the indications around how, like how AMP pages would get surfaced. There's a carousel treatment in terms of the user experience. But beyond all that, the ranking is going to be, principled. So as it is with things in Google search. So, at the end of the day, with a query, we want to try to answer the user's question. And so if answering that question is to show an article, and whether it's an AMP or not, then, that should be the first result we show. But if we can answer that question with an AMP result, then we would show that carousel, and then we, with that treatment, we may show additional articles, because you can basically, put those all horizontally arrayed and then be able to navigate through them. So I think that might be the first part of that question that was getting asked. And then can you run through I think there was a second part to it? Yeah, for sure. He says, how is AMP position related to current position data? Okay, so I think if that's asking about just kind of position of results on the search results page, my guidance there would be that you can look at g.co/amp demo to see the kind of way that Google is intending to launch with AMP, and then you can see that basically that carousel block kind of gets introduced there, but then there's still regular results below. So when we think about showing AMP results on the search results page, they initially at least will just show in that carousel position, and all of the other position and the ranking stemming from that would be basically the same. Great, and I think this is slightly related. Christian asks, is the in the news box in mobile going to be replaced entirely with the carousel you show in the g.co/amp demo? And what he specifically says or means is, are there non-AMP ready sites going to disappear from that box until they implement AMP versions of their news articles? So here again, I would say if you look at g.co/amp demo, you can see the kind of the way that I think Google Search plans to launch with AMP. There are, if I remember correctly, in that block there are some links that can be non-AMP. And then, of course, there's the AMP carousel. So these can both appear, and so it's not necessarily the case that a result would not appear because it's not implemented as an AMP page. That's great. One other question from Jeff Sechrist. He says, is there a certification or specific process to approve vendor configurations? Yeah, so we just, we asked, as I said at the outset, we asked the vendors to come, post an intent to implement issue. You should describe the way that you roughly expect your configuration to look. You should define the way that you expect the end user to implement it, to use to layer on top of your configuration. And then after that point, the normal approval process for the AMP project takes over. So we'll evaluate things for the performance and code quality characteristics that we're looking for. The vendor configuration doesn't introduce that many complexities around performance, because basically what you're doing is you're leveraging the core AMP analytics framework to specify the way that the configuration should work. But yeah, basically at that point, once you've done the intent to implement and we have visibility on it in the project, then we can iterate through the code reviews there. Great.
Another clarification question from Hannah. She says, in the console we see the following metrics. It is a Search Console related question. She says, in the console we see the following metrics for our content when it appears in SERPs: average position, clicks, impressions. Will these Search Console report include? Will these Search Console reports include AMP as well?
So as I said, I think I'm not deeply familiar with the Search Console plans, but I think the intent is to eventually support AMP. After all, it is a search result that is appearing on the search results page, and I think one goal would be to support that using the same metrics that are available today, at least. One thing I would note about that is the carousel treatment does introduce some differences, and so I think part of the product design exercise that we need to think through is how do you represent how do you represent those differences accurately in the Search Console view?
Great. And then Jesse says the g.co/amp demo link isn't working. Can we just get that URL again?
It should be g.co/amp demo. If you don't, you should see some sort of notice on the page saying that this is an accelerated mobile pages demo, and so that will let you know that you're reaching the right link. Mm-hmm. The way that the search experience is built, this will not trigger on all queries. So there could be a variety of reasons that you do not see, for example, the carousel and any AMP pages served there, for a variety of reasons related to ranking.
Also, try to.
I'm using the demo now. So just for the user's question, I search for something very newsy, like Obama. He's always in the news. I trigger the AMP carousel now. Mm-hmm. For something not quite as newsy, maybe Rudy Galfi. Sorry, you're not probably in the news every day, Rudy. I don't trigger anything. I don't trigger an AMP carousel for you, but for Barack Obama, I do. So it really just depends on the query that you're typing.
Keep working on it.
Try to go to it from a mobile device. That'll trigger the search results faster. Like you'll see the boxes quicker on mobile. Yeah. So try to see it on a phone.
Thank you for demoing that, Stacy. That's very nice. Another question, and then actually there's a couple quick questions here. We'll do a quick lightning round because we only have a few minutes left. Mr. Webmaster asks, where do we go for AMP support channel, or where we just find more information about this?
Yeah, so I know there's a community on Stack Overflow that asks and answers questions relating to AMP. The tag is amp-html. And I think it's pretty easy to find if you do a search and you're just, AMP, Stack Overflow, you should be able to get stuff there. If you go to the AMP project itself, there's a few resources. I think there's a mailing list, discussion mailing list listed there. We try to keep that limited to more discussions around building the framework, but it's if you think your case is especially interesting, or indeed if it's a bug, then we would welcome you to support it submit an issue so that we can follow up there.
Very cool. Got a question here. I'm not 100% sure what they're asking, but maybe somebody on the call has a better clue to that. What would you apply this AMP analytics via GTM?
I think that's Google Tag Manager.
I think.
I'm guessing it is.
Yeah.
So Google Tag Manager, for those that don't know, it's a product to help manage your tags. Pretty self-explanatory. So if you have different providers, like Rudy showed before, you can handle it via server-side configs that just get passed over very nicely to the page. So it's a very nice management solution. I know that team is looking into AMP now. I don't have any specific timeline for them, but right now you would not be using GTM with this.
Thanks. Two last questions we have here, and then we're going to wrap it up. Christian also asks, and this is more of a general question, and probably we'll punt this to other Hangouts later down the road, but like, what is happening with Adobe integration or any other third-party site for that matter? Don't have a ton of answers for that right now, but if anybody wanted to kind of give a hint to like where to find more information about that in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that if you look at the AMP Analytics page, like the documentation for the component, you'll see that as in the area where we list the different supported type attributes, you'll actually see a listing of all of the labels that are valid there, and those correspond to the vendors that have done integration. If you're especially willing, you can also poke around in the issue queue on the GitHub project, and you can see various intents to implement from different providers. I'll just name one. Like I know Parsley also has filed an intent to implement, and so that there's progress there too. So there's various ways to catch the status of these things. At the end of the day, it's not it's going to be most relevant to an end user when the implementation finally lands. And so in that regard, you can check the documentation, and you'll see listed all of the supported vendors. And beyond that, I'd definitely encourage get in touch with the analytics vendor that you use if you want to know about where they stand with support currently.
Perfect. Last question, new to AMP, will you be having more examples and demos? I still find it confusing on how to use it. This is a fantastic question. I can actually field this one myself. We are having additional Hangouts on air every Friday at 9 a.m. Pacific time, covering a wide range of different topics. And all of the Hangouts on air that we have done thus far are also available on our YouTube page. So if you have questions that have not been addressed yet, I definitely recommend checking out those prior events, and then check out our upcoming events as well. You can always add in your questions and comments into these Hangouts that we're doing, and we'll do our best to answer those. And in the meantime, wanted to thank everybody else that joined us today. Appreciate all your answers and the time that you took to go through all of this. Stacey, got any last notes to add?
I just wanted to thank Rudy and the guys from Google Analytics and Chartbeat joining, because analytics is such an important topic to all publishers. And there's a reason there are so many vendors to help measure all these things, because we're all just trying to make sense of all these various KPIs from clicks to scrolls. So I think, Rudy, you summarized it really well. In the philosophy of AMP is that you are measuring once, and you can report to as many vendors as you would like. And I think that's the perfect summary slide, the biggest takeaway that I got. So thanks so much, guys. And as Nick mentioned, next week we're discussing paywalls with product manager Ashwin Lemay. We've got ads after that. And then we're so lucky that Rudy's going to join us again for one last Hangout discussing different format innovations. So thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
See ya.